ನೀವೇ ಓಪನ್ ಮಾಡ್ತೀರಾ? ಸರ್ ಸ್ಟಾರ್ಟ್ ಆಯ್ತು ಅಂತ ಹೇಳ್ತೀರಾ ಸರ್? Good morning. In continuation with the neuroanatomy classes, today we will be doing the cerebellum. Before we begin, let's look at a clinical scenario where we have a 45-year-old person visiting his family physician, and he complains of clumsiness in his right hand whenever he is doing his routine work. This symptoms, you notice, has started since 3 months, so it indicates the chronicity of the problem, and it is getting worse day by day. Is also notice tremors. Tremors is unintentional movements are called as tremors, which disappears when he stops writing. He also told he tends to sway, that means he is losing his balance while walking. When a neurologist examined him, there was hypotonia of the muscles, and when he was asked to walk in a straight line, he swayed over to the right side, and there were a lot of other symptoms also. So, seeing this clinical scenario here, we can make out that most of the problems what the person is facing is motor problems, okay, and it is something to do with his equilibrium. He is not able to maintain his balance, his activity, motor activities, skilled activities are affected. So, we will see which organ we are going to deal with today. So, this is the organ of our interest today here, the cerebellum. So, we will be dealing the cerebellum under the following headings: introduction, gross anatomy, the subdivisions, anatomical, morphological, functional, the deep cerebellar nuclei, the cytoarchitecture of the cerebellum, the input and output to the cerebellum, functions, blood supply and applied anatomy. So, now coming to the introduction. We all know the cerebellum, we have already studied the brainstem. So, brainstem consists of midbrain, pons and medulla. Behind brain consists of your pons, medulla and cerebellum. The cerebellum is situated in the posterior cranial fossa below the tentorium cerebelli. So, this green color structure what you are seeing here is the tentorium cerebelli, which is separating the cerebrum from the cerebellum. And anterior to the cerebellum, you can see you have the pons and the medulla, which is separated by a cavity here, which is the fourth ventricle. Okay, and this green structure what you are seeing beneath here is the continuation of the dura mater, and between the two cerebellar hemispheres we have the falx cerebelli. So, here you can see this is the cerebellum. Here you will get the tentorium cerebelli separating the cerebrum from the cerebellum, and between the two cerebellar hemispheres you will get the falx cerebelli. Here you are seeing the pons and the medulla oblongata. This is the cavity of the fourth ventricle. Now, this cerebellum is connected to each and every part of the brainstem through tract of fibers which are called as cerebellar peduncles. They are 3 in number, each one for one part of the brainstem. So, you have superior cerebellar peduncle which connects the midbrain with the cerebellum. Then you have the middle cerebellar peduncle connecting the pons with the cerebellum, and this is the inferior cerebellar peduncle which connects the medulla oblongata with the cerebellum. Now, coming to the gross anatomy, just like the old architecture what we see in the cerebrum, the cerebellum also consists of an outer gray matter, an inner white matter, and some masses of gray matter within the white matter which are called as the deep cerebellar nuclei. In the picture you can see here, the outer gray matter is thrown into folds, just like how you see in the cerebrum, the sulci and gyri. But in comparison, you can see these sulci or the depressions what you are seeing here, unlike in the cerebellum which have thick sulci, you have very fine sulci here which is called as fissures, and the gray matter separating between the two fissures are called as the folia. Now coming to the white matter extend into each and every folia, and this extension appears like the branching of a tree, and hence this is called as arbor vitae cerebelli. Now this folia and fissures are formed to increase the surface area for the presence of neurons. Just like how you see villi in intestine which increases the surface area for absorption, in the cerebellum to increase the number of neurons, you have these fissures and folia present. Now coming to the subdivisions. The cerebellum is divided into two hemispheres, right and left. Okay, they are connected by a midline structure called as the vermis, which is a worm-like structure. So you can see this here. This is the superior surface of the cerebellum you are having a look at, and this is the inferior surface of the cerebellum. Now these are the two cerebellar hemispheres. So all these lobes like structure what you are seeing are the folia, and in between them are the fissures. Now this is the superior surface you are seeing, that is just beneath the tentorium cerebelli, and this is the inferior surface you will be able to see. Now on the superior surface you are seeing the two cerebellar hemisphere appear to be continuous to each other through the superior vermis, whereas on the inferior surface you can clearly make out a notch present here, and this notch is called as the vallecula. Now these two cerebellar hemispheres, vermis, in the posterior cranial fossa are divided into two surfaces. This is called as the superior surface and this is called as the inferior surface, and this is brought about by this fissure which is called as the horizontal fissure. Horizontal fissure is basically a mechanical fissure which is formed as the cerebellum gets fitted into the posterior cranial fossa. So you can see here all along this what you have here, this is your horizontal fissure. Now on the superior surface, this there is another fissure which is called as the fissura prima. These fissures separate the cerebellum into what is called as lobes. So these forms the anatomical subdivisions of the cerebellum. So cerebellum can be divided into an anterior lobe, a posterior lobe and a flocculonodular lobe with the help of two fissures. One is the posterolateral fissure and another one is the fissura prima. So you can see here the superior surface is divided with the help of the fissura prima into an anterior 2/3 and a posterior 1/3. This anterior part forms what is called as the anterior lobe of the cerebellum, and this posterior part along with some part in the inferior surface forms what is called as the posterior lobe. Now here there is a separation present. This is called as the posterolateral fissure. This separates a separate lobule here, and this is called as the flocculonodular lobe. So when you spread out the cerebellum and keep both the superior and inferior surfaces in continuity, you can make out this is the, so it will be like this. So this will be the horizontal fissure. This horizontal fissure is dividing it into a superior surface and an inferior surface. Okay, so now we have spread out this like this, and you can see this is the fissura prima dividing the cerebellum into, this is the anterior lobe, and this is the posterolateral fissure. This is called as the flocculonodular lobe. The rest between the anterior and the flocculonodular lobe forms what is called as the posterior lobe or the middle lobe of the cerebellum. Now they have been labeled. So from in the vermis from above downwards, this is the lingula, this is the central lobule, this is the culmen, declive, folium, tuber, pyramid, uvula and nodule. These are the subdivisions which are present on the vermis. Their corresponding elongations on the cerebellar hemisphere are as follows. Lingula does not have any lateral extension. Central lobule have what is called as ala. Culmen has what is called as quadrangular lobule. Declive has lobulus simplex. Folium has superior semilunar lobule. This one has inferior semilunar lobule. Pyramid has bilateral lobule. Uvula has tonsil and nodule is related to the flocculus. So, this together is called as the flocculonodular lobe. So, this has been summarized for you here. So, anterior lobe is separated from the posterior lobe with the help of fissura prima. Posterior lobe is separated from the flocculonodular lobe with the help of posterolateral fissure. On the anterior lobule, the subdivisions of vermis are as follows: lingula, central lobule and culmen. And on the cerebellar hemispheres, lingula does not have any lateral projection, central lobule and culmen are as follows. So, for each lobe, there is a subdivision of the vermis and its corresponding subdivision of the cerebellar hemisphere. This forms what is called as the anatomical subdivisions of the cerebellum. Now, these each one of them correspond to certain functions or to certain morphology. We will see that coming now. Coming to the morphological subdivisions, according to the development, which part of the cerebellum develops first, we have three parts which is called as the archicerebellum, representing the oldest cerebellum to develop, and it was seen in aquatic mammals. It is concerned with the vestibular function and mainly concerned with control of equilibrium and posture of the body. The next to develop was the paleocerebellum, which was seen in terrestrial vertebrates, which has mainly the spinal control, and this is concerned with control of movements of the limbs. The latest to develop and seen in mammals was the neocerebellum, which has connections with the cerebrum and the pons, and this is mainly concerned with fine coordination of skillful movements. Okay. So, now the components or what represents these lobes are: archicerebellum is represented by the flocculonodular lobe and the lingula. This has connections with all of these morphological subdivisions have connections with the deep cerebellar nuclei. So, the four nuclei are nuclear vestigi, nuclei ಬರ್ತಾ ಇಲ್ಲ ಮ್ಯಾಮ್, ಅಲ್ಲಿ ತೋರಿಸ್ತಿಲ್ಲ, ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಕೈಗೆ ಬರ್ತಿದೆ. So the subdivisions of morphological subdivisions are the archicerebellum forming the oldest part of the cerebellum, represented by the flocculonodular lobe and lingula, and it's concerned with maintenance of equilibrium. The paleocerebellum, the next one to develop, seen in terrestrial vertebrates, represented by the whole of anterior lobe, obviously excepting the lingula, but includes also the pyramid and the uvula. This has connections with the nucleus interpositus of the deep cerebellar nuclei and this controls crude movements of the limbs. And the most recently developed is the neocerebellum and it is seen in mammals and is represented by whole of the posterior lobe, and this is the one which is concerned with smooth performance of highly skilled voluntary movements of precision. If we come to the functional subdivisions, now these has been divided. The main flocculonodular lobe, which represents the archicerebellum, is concerned with the vestibular system. The rest of one, which is divided, is called as the corpus cerebelli and is divided into three zones: the median zone or the vermal zone, a paramedian or the intermediate zone, and the hemispherical or the lateral zones. So the median zone has connection with the vestigial nucleus and this is mainly concerned with maintenance of equilibrium, and this is through the control of movements of the trunk and the tone of the extensor muscles. The intermediate zone is controlling those of the flexor muscle tone. So combined median zone and paramedian zone is concerned with maintenance of equilibrium and also the posture of the body during walking, running, etc., and also the control of the axial and the limb movements. The lateral zone is the one which is helping in skillful movements, and this is helping in the coordination of the distal limb muscles for skillful action, for repeated activity, for learning of skill action. This is what is helping the lateral zone. So these was the subdivisions. So here you can see this is the median zone, the paramedian zone, and this is the lateral zone. You can see each of their connections with the deep cerebellar nuclei, and here what are they going to perform. So you can see the midline and the paramedian zone helps in motor execution. Doing the activity is controlled by your median and paramedian zone, whereas planning that activity, how should that be done, to what extent it should be done, that is done by your lateral zone. The more skillful action is controlled by the cerebrum and that is done by the lateral aspects, whereas the midline brings about that. So it is the action zone. So these were the subdivisions: anatomical subdivisions, morphological subdivisions, and functional subdivisions of the cerebellum. Now all of these divisions are connected to the masses of gray matter which is present within the white matter, which is called as the deep cerebellar nuclei. There are 4 pairs, so one on each side, and those are from medial to lateral: nucleus vestigi, nucleus globosus, and nucleus emboliformis, which are together called as nucleus interpositus and nucleus dentatus. So in the picture you can see that crumpled U-shaped bag-like structure. What you are seeing is the nucleus dentatus, then emboliformis and globosus, and in the midline almost near the roof of the fourth ventricle. Hence it is also called as the roof nucleus. You can see the vestigial nucleus. So each of them, so dentate nucleus is concerned with the lateral zone of the cerebellum, helping in skillful movements. You can see here in the picture, emboliform nucleus, and this is the globose nucleus, together called as the interposed nuclei. They represent the paleocerebellum and concerned with control of posture and tone of limb and axial muscles. And this is the vestigial nucleus, the oldest one, and concerned with maintenance of equilibrium, concerned with archicerebellum. Next, coming to the cytoarchitecture, this we have already done in detail in the histology class. We'll just be doing a revision here. So you are seeing there are 3 layers. Outermost is the molecular layer, that light pink what you are seeing. Then the middle layer or single layer of Purkinje cells here, the flower shaped cells what you are seeing there. And the innermost, the dark pink stain there, that what you are seeing is the granular layer. And inside one, what is the labeled as WM is the white matter, the arbor vitae cerebelli. So we have already also seen what kind of cells we have here. Stellate cells and basket cells seen in the outer molecular layer, Purkinje cells seen in the middle layer, granular cells and Golgi cells within the granular layer. So here we are just going to do a brief review. So in the molecular layer, you are going to see basket cells and stellate cells, the gray colored one. In the middle, this flower shaped cells, what you are seeing here is your Purkinje cells, and innermost in the granular layer, what you are seeing here is the granular cell and Golgi cells. Okay. So the stellate cells, dendrites gets arborized in the molecular layer. The axons go and synapse with the Purkinje cells. Purkinje cells, dendrites also arborize in the molecular layer. The axons go and synapse with the the output of the cerebellum is formed mainly by your Purkinje cell, which goes on to the deep cerebellar nuclei. Now the granular cells which are seen within the granular layer, they form the excitatory output of the cerebellum. So you can see the axons of these granular cells will go towards the molecular layer and divide into what is called as the parallel fibers. Now to the input to the cerebellum is mainly through 2 fibers, what is called as the olivary fibers and climbing fibers and mossy fibers. So these come and arborize both in the molecular layer and the granular layer. So here they are forming what is called as a cerebellar glomerulus. It is a rosette formed by the mossy fibers. They synapse with the axons of Golgi cells and the dendrites of granular cells. So all the cells of the cerebellum, stellate cells, basket cells, Purkinje cells are inhibitory in nature, except for your granular cell, which is only the excitatory neuron what you get in the cerebellum. So the output coming from the cerebellum is inhibitory in the nature, and it is also the largest collection of inhibitory neurons what you can find in the central nervous system. So this is the rosette what you are going to see here. This is the axons of the Golgi cells, dendrites of the granular cells, along with the rosette formed by your mossy fibers. So final input. So input to the cerebellum is through the climbing fibers, which are excitatory coming from the inferior olivary nucleus, mossy fibers which are also excitatory but which comes from all parts of the brainstem and spinal cord, and the final output is from the Purkinje cell, which comes as an inhibitory response. So what are the inputs which are coming to the cerebellar cortex? So the connections of the cerebellum, you have input and output form. Input is mainly through 2 types of fibers, that is the climbing fibers and mossy fibers. Climbing fibers originate from a single region in the medulla oblongata, which is the inferior olivary nucleus, and they make multiple synapses with the Purkinje cells, resulting in high frequency bursts, or also called as complex spikes. Now this helps in conditioning of the Purkinje reflexes and also helps in motor learning of a new activity, skilled activity. Control, this is mainly done by your climbing fibers. The second type of fibers what you see which forms the cerebellar glomeruli are your mossy fibers, and they come from many centers in the brainstem and spinal cord. They are providing input from the eyes, from the ears, from the spinal cord, proprioceptive impulses coming from the limbs, touch receptors, everything is brought through your mossy fibers. They also make multiple synapses in the Purkinje fibers either directly or through interneurons. But here they result in simple spikes unlike that of the climbing fibers. They synapse on the granule cells and form what is called as the glomeruli. The axons of granule cells then bifurcate in the molecular layer to form parallel fibers, and these will synapse with the dendrites of Purkinje cells. So, the only excitatory neuron is your granule cells, which is seen in the granular layer. Now, this is a summary of all the afferent fibers which are coming as mossy fibers into the cerebellum. A wide variety of tracts are there which you have already studied in physiology. Now, what is the output which is coming from the cerebellum? So, the cerebellum has to go and control the motor activity. We were talking about equilibrium, motor activity. So, the output from the cerebellum is to the deep nuclei of the cerebellum, what we have already seen. So, what is this deep nuclei, from where they go? So, from the vestibular cerebellum or the archicerebellum, the fibers, they originate in the vermis and they pass to the fastigial nucleus, and from there they go to the reticular formation and also to the vestibular nuclei. From there, as the vestibulospinal tract and the reticulospinal tract, they go and control the movements in the axial skeleton, neck, shoulder and hip muscles. From the spinal cerebellum, the deep nuclei involved here is the nucleus globosus and the nucleus emboliformis, and from the medial part of the cerebellum they go to the different parts of the thalamus, and from there to the cerebral cortex, and this is helping in movements of the peripheral parts, that is in the limbs. So, archicerebellum or vestibular cerebellum was concerned with the trunk muscles, whereas the spinocerebellum is concerned with the movements in the limbs. From the most lateral part, finally, you have the cerebellum. Here, they pass to the dentate nucleus and then to the thalamus, and here they coordinate in the planning of these movements through a wide variety of functions, what we will be seeing later. So, this forms the final output, and these output comes through what is called as the cerebellar peduncles, bringing both afferent and efferent fibers, which we will be dealing in the next class, the 3 cerebellar peduncles. Now, coming to the functions of the cerebellum. So, first main function is regulation of the tone of the muscle, the posture of the muscle and the equilibrium of the body. Now, equilibrium is mainly done by receiving impulses from the vestibular nuclei, inputs from the cochlea and inputs from the eye, and this is done with the help of the vestibulocerebellum. Regulation of tone and posture is done by receiving impulses from the proprioceptive receptors present in the muscles, tendons and joints, so that they can know the position sense, joint sense, also including the visual and auditory receptors. So, for you, even if you close your eyes, you are able to know where you are standing, and with your eyes closed, when you hear something, you are able to understand if something is coming at you. All this is with the help of the cerebellum. Then regulation of coordinated movements. It is done by a wide variety of actions: damping action, control of ballistic movements, timing and programming these movements, servo mechanism and comparator function. All this is coordinated by your neocerebellum. So, what is this function of corticocerebellum? Many of them are there. Coming to each one. Now, the cerebellum activity, how does it learn to do? It is a repeated activity. Now, when you start learning to walk, each time you make a mistake, each time you fall, you are learning. Your cerebellum is learning how to correct those mistakes. So, finally, when you say you are perfect in that movement, it is because of repeated learning by the cerebellum, self-correction or auto-correction which has been done by the cerebellum. So, the fine balancing adjustments you make while standing and walking, and also the ability to fine tune a complex pattern of, see, when you start learning to type your computer, first one, your speed is very, very slow. You look for the QWERTY keywords, where is Q, where is A, where is delete. But after some time, if you've seen a typist, she's hardly looking at the keyboard. She's directly seeing the monitor and she goes on typing very fast without even realizing where the keys are. So, she has learned this. So, this planning and activity is done by your cerebellum. So, it comes in a fluid mosaic pattern. So, what is this damping function? Damping function is it prevents the exaggerated muscular activities. It makes these activities smooth and accurate. They are initiated in the cerebellar cortex. After receiving the information from the cortex, it also receives the information from the periphery and it sees if there is an error in that, and then that error gets cancelled because of appropriate impulses sent from the cerebellum and the smoothing of the function is done. So, the extra sends information back to the motor cortex to cut off those extra impulses. Next is ballistic movements. Rapid alternate movements in different parts of the body are called as ballistic movements. These are especially used when you are doing skilled work like writing, typing, dancing, cycling, etc. Now, this pre-planning of these movements is done especially in your lateral zone of your corticocerebellum. Then planning of sequential movements. When a movement has to occur, when you are cycling, when the leg has to come up, when the leg has to go down, how you should maintain your leg on the pedal. All this planning and the sequence, that sequence is planned by your cerebellum only. All the information from the corticocerebellum is communicated to the sensory motor area and it is stored in the memory. So, every time you call for that action, without any glitches in that, without any technical error, you are able to do the smooth. So, every time you start cycling, you don't look like a beginner. In the initial parts, only you might go back, come front, but once you have learnt that activity, it is always a smooth function which is occurring. Then comparator function, it is responsible for integration and coordination of various muscular activities. So, this is done by receiving impulses from both from the cortex and from the periphery. It compares both whether the input received from the sensory or the peripheral part is correct, has the cortex interpreted properly and giving it an appropriate response. If the response is not appropriate, again correction signals are sent back, and finally. So, you should imagine how functional or how good your body is, that this is all occurring within less than microseconds. You are able to react to all these things. Servo mechanism is a correction of disturbance or interference whenever you are having any performing any skilled work. So, once these skilled works are learnt, as I was talking about earlier, these are performed again without any interruption. So, if there is any disturbance, the corticocerebellum will immediately come into function and correct the disturbance from its memory and help you to do those skilled work. Then other functions are also there, helps to time events other than the movements of the body. For example, the rates of progression of both auditory and visual phenomena are predicted by the brain, but both of these require cerebellar participation. So, you cannot learn something that somebody is coming running at you, a dog is running at you and is going to bite you, something like that. So, for all that, you are going to hear and you are going to see, and those are fastly done by the cerebellum. So, these were also the main functions of the cerebellum. To summarize them, they are going to help in maintaining equilibrium, posture, and help in coordinated motor activity and skillful movements. The blood supply of cerebellum is by 3 arteries. The superior surface is supplied by the superior cerebellar artery, which is a branch of the basilar artery. The upper part of inferior surface is supplied by the anterior inferior cerebellar artery, again a branch of basilar artery. And the lower part is supplied by the posterior inferior cerebellar artery, which is a branch of your vertebral artery. So, all this what we have learned is to see the same thing in a clinical scenario. So, whenever a patient with some cerebellar lesion comes to you, how will you identify them? So, these lesions can be due to either trauma or any vascular occlusion of any of the above arteries we have talked about, or any tumor. You might have studied in the brainstem with pons, cerebellopontine tumor, medulloblastoma. And this we have already seen with all the functions of cerebellum. This is mainly going to affect your motor system. And since there is crossing of fibers, the lesions are ipsilateral. That means If the cerebellum on the right hemisphere is affected, you're going to see the signs and symptoms on the same side. So what are these certain signs of certain symptoms? So you can correlate them according to the functions, for which will be easier for you to remember also. So archicerebellar, we have studied that it is concerned with vestibular part and concerned with disturbance of equilibrium. So when the equilibrium is lost, the person is not able to maintain balance. So he will not be able to stand straight. So he keeps on swaying like this. He is not able to maintain that spatial configuration. He'll sway from side to side. And if you ask him to move in a straight line, with his eyes open, probably he might be able to do so. But because he's receiving his auditory impulses and visual impulses, and they might help in correction. But if the person walks in a straight line with his eyes closed, he tends to sway on the same side whichever his lesion is there, because he is not able to correct himself. And this is seen as a drunken gait. With a wide base, the person moves about. So you can see this is called as cerebellar ataxia, the person moving with a wide gait and is swaying towards the side of the lesion. So if you come to the neocerebellar signs, that is concerned with your skillful movements, you can see three main things which are occurring. First thing is the tone of the muscle is lost, which is called as hypotonia. So that stiffness in your movements is not seen. The second thing is involuntary movement which is occurring, which is called as tremor. And this tremor, the key word here used is intention tremor. If I am standing still like this, no involuntary movement is seen. But suppose I start to do some movement, suppose I start to write, then suddenly my hands start shaking. So when I want to do some work, the movement, involuntary movement occurs. So that is why it is called as intentional tremor. As soon as I stop doing that work, or I think of stop doing that, the tremor disappears. So there is no resting tremors. This is one of the important things to differentiate from other types of tremors. And you can see a variety of disturbance in muscular coordination, and that is called as asynergia. Now there are various forms of asynergia. Now ataxia is incoordination of your trunk and pelvic and pectoral girdles, what you've already seen that gait. Dysmetria, inability to measure distance. Now the stick is kept on the table here. If I want to pick it up, I have to go, my hand should reach out to that part of the table and pick it up. But I am unable to judge the distance from till what level I should go. So either I may overshoot the object which I want to take or undershoot that. So that is called as dysmetria. Then decomposition of movements. My movements are not smooth. Now when I am talking to you, I can easily stretch out my hand and come back. This is looking like a fluid motion. But because in cerebellar, I am not able to judge the distance, the impulses received from the periphery are not perfect, the movements will be something like this. I will plan and it will be in short jerks. So it will look like a puppet movement or a robotic movement. Then something called as dysdiadochokinesis or adiadochokinesis, that is inability to perform rapid alternative movements. So you ask him to pronate and supinate his arms repeatedly, he will not be able to do so. So you can see that person is not able to walk. Tandem gait, okay, when you ask him to walk like toe to toe, he will not be able to do that. Dysmetria, so he is not able to reach the glass, he might pour it down. And you can do finger pointing. You can point a finger like this, ask him to touch the tip of your finger, he will not be able to do so. Either he will go that side or this side. And also he is not able to judge. The agonist and antagonist muscles are not being able to control. So whenever I am flexing, the extensor muscles are also acting and helping in controlling of movements. So in the test below there, what you are seeing, the doctor is asking to flex forcibly and suddenly he removes his hand. The person is not able to control. If our flexor muscles are working properly, then we will stop here. But you are seeing here, he is going to hit himself in the face. So that is called as the rebound phenomenon. Inability to check the action of agonist and antagonist muscle. And dysarthria is occurring because unable to coordinate the movements of the muscles of speech. So, there is a slurred speech present. Nystagmus, inability to coordinate the extraocular muscles results in um, oscillatory movements of the eyeballs, which are called as the nystagmus. So, sometimes nystagmus, dysarthria and intentional tremors forms the triad seen in cerebellar ataxia, which is called as Charcot's triad. So, to summarize here, the cerebellum, the main center for the coordination of motor activities, divided into anterior lobe, middle or posterior lobe and a flocculonodular lobe, two cerebellar hemispheres. Okay. So, now you will be able to explain all the clinical scenario what you are seeing here. Clumsiness because of not able to control his motor activity, intentional tremors. You can see that noticed tremors when he started writing and disappeared as he stopped writing. So, intentional tremors going absent when he rests. Swaying, so equilibrium is lost there. The hypotonia of the muscles when the neurologist was checking, and you can see there when he was asked to touch the tip of his nose with his right index finger, the finger started tremoring. Again intentional tremor, and as it was nearing the nose, it overshot the target. And when he was asked to perform rapidly alternating movements, he was not able to do so. So, all the signs and symptoms now you are able to explain with the help of which part of cerebellum is involved and why is it occurring so. So, this was about the cerebellum, the subdivisions, the functions and applied anatomy. Usually cerebellum is asked as a main question. Even when you go to your clinical side, cerebellar ataxia is a main case for you, and you have to describe the cerebellum under following headings: location, subdivisions and their function, the cells of cerebellum with their connections and applied anatomy. Thank you.